Så det er sikkert noen slides som jeg har glemt at jeg la inn der, så det kan bli litt sånn klumsete.
Første regel, aldri si fra om feilen på forhånd.
Jeg gjør alltid feil, og jeg vil gjerne si fra om det.
Det er så det jeg sier, jeg er nervøs. Begynner å si at han er nervøs, det er fint.
Viktigste er å være helt ærlig om feilene. I guess I should do it in English. Yes, that's the language of the conference. My name is Andreas Rønning. I'm a software developer with Fudu Systems in Oslo. Software developer is now like, I think our new name, since Flash is no longer cool. Last year I was allowed to do an elevator pitch, and after that I was apparently invited back to do a full hour. And originally I was going to do a talk about how much I hate the internet and how the internet sucks and it should burn. But I figured it would be more interesting if you guys actually took something away that you liked. So this session is called Doomsday Console for Fun and Profit. I'll get into what that means. First of all, we should talk about demands of the user interface. And always, the demands of the user interface is different between the user. The end user has different demands than you as the developer. The end user needs usability, needs a different kind of sequence of states. The end user needs to be able to do certain things in a certain order, and they need to know what they're doing at all times. Whereas we, the developers, once we develop our applications and we put them out there, we kind of become slaves to what the end user needs. Like, we stop being kind of like gods of our own creation, in a sense. We need power, we don't need usability. We need to be able to do whatever the hell we want. So, according to Orwell, power is in inflicting pain and humiliation. Power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing. No good reason that's in there. I just think it's a cool quote. But we are going to talk about tearing things apart and putting them back together again. The Doomsday Console is a Flash library written in ActionScript 3, targeting Flash Player 10 and up. And it gives you power in 3 ways. First of all, power is in knowing what others don't. And for us, that means logging or tracing. So how many here actually uses like an external logging framework or some pretty good. Pretty much, I think everybody at some point needs, if not like detailed logging, you need some kind of tool for reading logs. And the Doomsday Console handles this by implementing a logging framework called Slf IS, which stands for Simple Logging Facade for ActionScript. It's not really a port of Slf4j, which is the Java variant of that, but it kind of takes the API of Slf4j and transfers that into an ActionScript context. And Slf4j is the successor to log4j, which is the sort of the standard Apache logging library now. It's kind of outdated at this point, but it's quite commonly used. And what Slf4s gives you is tracing, but with context and importance. What that means, the context is essentially a description of what the message is, in a sense. Like, where does it come from? Like, what said this? Like, if you just trace hello, that doesn't mean anything at all. If you trace hello from the class, I guess like a user or something, then the user class said hello, so that's some context for your information. Second, you have the importance of the messages. Some messages you don't care about, but you do care if something crashed or something broke. Like, you don't care about, the other guy's fuck off trace message. Like, that's not really interesting. But you do care if the user couldn't log on or anything. And Slf4AS gives you this through 2 properties, the tag and the level. And the tag per message is, the context, and that's typically the name of the class that sent the message, but it can be whatever you want it to be. So it could be a longer description of what the message is. And you're going to reuse that tag across several messages, so you know where all those messages come from and what all those messages mean. Secondly, you have what's called the logging level, or the message level. And that is how important that message is. And kind of like a numeric score, and the higher that score is, the more important it is, obviously. There are 5 built-in levels in Slf4AS, starting with the least important at the top, counterintuitively. The debug messages are, typical traces that you'll stick in your application, like while you're just developing. you're always going to do these, like, maybe you hit the button and that dispatches an event and that goes somewhere, but it doesn't happen. So you're just going to put like a trace in there to make sure things happen in the order that you thought it would be. It's not important information for everyone, but it's information that's important for you in the moment. Above that, you have info messages, and info messages are stuff you regularly want to know about, like you successfully loaded the configuration file, or you did connect to the server, or all the assets are loaded, stuff like that. Above that is warnings are a little bit harder to define because you've got to define for yourself, how bad something has gone. But typically, a warning is when something is slightly off. Like you can deal with it, but it's something that went a little off center, and that could be things like the user quit the application, but it didn't save his work, things like that. Above that again are errors. Errors are, in this case, they're more like things that broke within the logic of your application. Like, they're things that broke because the user tried to do something wrong. They're not something that's necessarily a flaw in your programming, so it doesn't mean your application is going to die. It just means something didn't go as intended, which means you can recover from it. A fatal error, on the other hand, is completely unrecoverable. That's things like you couldn't connect. You couldn't even download anything, any of the assets, and it's just a blank window and everything's fucked. And combined with a tag level, you can start filtering out messages. You can start saying, okay, I only want my errors, or I only want messages from this class, or I want messages with this tag. And I'm just going to show you how that works real quick. This is not my laptop, by the way. I got to get used to this.
It's an awesome laptop.
It's pretty good. Kind of. I just got used to the FM key not being on the far right, and I have to get fuck you. Anyway, I was going to do this like super structured, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to do it straight from that. Slf IS works by defining a logger object. And this logger object will take care of some of that metadata for you. So in this case, we want to create a logger for our main class. And typically, you're going to try and make a logger like a static constant. Like you're going to want to reuse the same logger across multiple instances of a class. So in this case, let's see, private static const. Like the shorter the better, which is an ilogger, and that comes from the logging get logger with main. Now we have a logger, which is good. And from there on, like the ilogger object has a bunch of methods you're going to be reusing. Get pattern type and set pattern type and log are kind of like power user stuff, but for typical purposes, you're going to be using the debug error, fatal, info, and warning. So in this case, I'm just going to trace hello world. Build that. It will actually build. And there we go in the output. It's the first message, 0 index. It's a debug type. It comes from main, and it says hello world. And so forth. So if I say warn, shit happened, and build that again, and I do all things wrong always. That's how I roll. There we go. And there we go again. So in this case, Slf IS, since we haven't actually implemented the Doomsday Console, it's just mapping to the trace function. So you're going to get it through your regular output. We're going to get into the actual console in a bit. Just need to get this set. So at this point, we can start doing some basic filtering. Let's say we don't want our debug messages. The logging class has a bunch of static methods. So we can say we want to set the level to levels. Whoa! God damn it. There we go. We only want our warnings, for instance. And then we only get warnings. But levels, again, work kind of incrementally. So we're going to get warnings and errors and fatal errors, but we're not going to get info or debug messages. It's just kind of like a binary gate. Another way you can start doing filtering is by tag. And to demonstrate that, I'm just going to create a new class real quick. Just go to food. And one thing you're going to want to do if you're going to be using this thing is you're going to want a snippet for creating loggers. In this case, I've written one real quick. Like any programming IDE lets you do this. Like, any programming IDE worth anything will let you do that anyway. It should save you a lot of time. So in this case, I'm going to do a debug message of whatever. Doesn't really matter. And what you do when you only want messages from a certain class is you do what I've called whitelisting of classes. It's kind of like an inclusive process. Instead of saying everything you don't want, you just say the things that you want. So in this case, we whitelist the foo class, create a new foo, run it, and we only get the foo message. But you can also whitelist like several classes. It's just a comma separated list of classes. So if you want both main and foo and whatever, just keep appending classes. And if you just want everything, you just call whitelist, and it will just pass in an empty array. Another thing about Slf IS, which I think is really cool, but in a super nerdy way, is something called Slf Formatting, obviously. So in this case, here's a classic example. You have my name is, and you add a name variable. Or say you want to concatenate that together. Name, and I am age years old. Where are these guys? In this case, I mean, you know how this is going to work, right? Not at all. Perfect. It's like the horrors of trying to code anything live. Anyway, you get the expected results. The thing is to remember here is that this string concatenation, even if we have a logging level set higher than info, it's still going to concatenate that string. Like, it's still going to cost you those cycles that it takes to do 2 strings on anything that isn't actually a string, etc., etc. So in a worst case scenario, say we have like several thousand traces of something that's below the current logging level, and it does like a 2 string on something and then does a function to do a query, whatever, that stuff is still going to get called even if you don't get the traces. And what SLF does is instead of concatenating right away, you define a pattern with these braces. And then you simply append what you want in there. It's still going to give you the same result, but you're not going to have that concatenation. And it also lets you repeat things. So let's say we want, I don't know, Gomar, I guess. Yeah. You're an old-ass man. And it's just going to loop over the pattern and give you several outputs in the same format. So it gives you some flexibility there, too. If you want, I can do a performance test of this stuff, but it'll save you like 75% of the cycles if you do a huge set of traces. So that's nice if you trace absolutely everything in the world. So that's how logging works for now. Secondly, power is in being able to do what others can't. And that kind of returns to the thing I said earlier about what our demands are of the UI versus what the user has for demands. And what we typically do, and I don't know if it's, I think everybody has their own methods for this stuff. I think everyone I know at some point has written some sort of text field for outputting trace messages when they have published their application to the web, or like putting in some temporary button somewhere, or a slider for setting a value, like giving themselves some extra power while they're working. It's kind of a chore to do. I'm certainly tired of it. What the Doomsday Console does is it implements a command line interface to your application, which is kind of a mechanism for executing functions and changing parameters at runtime in whatever state or context you want. So it's not bound to being in the right menu or being in the right, having the right objects. And so you can just call whatever. If it breaks everything, you can just go and break your application any way you want, which is sometimes very useful. Like I said, it lets you call any function. The way it does that is you specify a string as the command identifier, and then it maps that to a function internally. So when you type that string, it's going to call that function. On top of that, it actually lets you kind of like hack your application in a sense of by going through objects, finding public properties, finding their public properties again, and so on and so forth, letting you pretty much mess about with anything that can reach either through the display list or as a public member. And you can extend the command line with plugins, so you can kind of create your own weird, esoteric, specific implementation of a command that is really specific to your application, without having to, expect the console to do absolutely everything for everyone. Oh, wow, I managed to edit it over again. And of course, when you call a command, when you call a function through a command, you can also append arguments to that command. So you can call any function with any set of arguments as well. The advantages to an interface like this over like buttons and sliders and components is, first of all, you can pretty much do anything through text if you want to type, if you have the time to type it in, obviously. Text, short of like really evocative, emotional music, you can pretty much describe anything through text. It's really intuitive to use. Even my mom knows how to put text into a text field and hit the enter key. And of course, since it's verbal, it's actually easier to understand than a set of components placed around the screen. Like if you have a debugging interface and you have to hit if you're talking to a client and they have to use this thing, it's like, oh, you have to hit that tab, and then there's a button on the far right, and then you scroll down. You don't have to do any of that. It's just, okay, here's the console. You type in the command, hit the enter key. What does it say? Like, read me the log. It lets you kind of talk to the application through your customer in some ways. And third of all, yeah, you can just keep creating commands, and it's not going to create like a clutter situation where you have tons and tons and tons of different things that are in your way of getting things done the way you want to get them done. Third, sometimes you're still going to need those sliders and buttons and things, especially if you're going to do like interactive changing properties and you want some kind of, you want to play around with things in a more chaotic way. Like the command line is good for doing precise things, but it's not really good for just playing around, and sometimes you want components for doing that. And the console offers an area where you can put those things, where you can, kind of like a window kind of interface where you can stick all your temporary buttons and knobs and everything. And also plugins, be they for commands or for UI, they can do pretty much anything the console can do. And since the console can know anything, hello?
By now, I would wonder, how does the console look like?
You will know in a second. I know this is where I struggle. The thing with this thing is like, it's so broad. You have to figure out where to start. It's impossible. Anyway, just go on to that. Here's some typical developer consoles from games, because games tend to do these. I don't think there's any game I've played on the PC that didn't have a developer console somewhere. The Quake 3, like the first console I used was for Quake 1, and it just seemed magical in a sense. You can boot this thing up and it gives you this log of numbers and shit, and it just looked like you can look inside the machine as it starts up, and then it goes, and wow, that's cool, but where was that console again? And the stuff you could do in games like Quake, just through messing about with the console, can give you so much information about the game. Here's the console for Unreal. It doesn't do a logging thing, but it does do autocomplete, and it lets you call commands, which is nice. It's the console for the Unreal Engine on iOS, which you bring up with like this 4-finger swipe. Again, not a logger, but it lets you execute commands. More common interfaces, terminal and command line for Windows. Again, like, why do we need this stuff? Because this shit is incredibly boring. Like, it's just an incredibly rote way of working where you go into your code, you build your application. If you have a complex application, it's going to take you like maybe a couple of minutes to build in some cases. And then you try something and it breaks, and you're like, oh, what happened? And you go back to your code and you try something new and you build again for a couple of minutes, and then it breaks. It's the most horribly demotivating way of working. Messing about with your application in ways it doesn't intend can give you information in ways, like, because if you created like components for doing specific things, that still wouldn't let you play around. It wouldn't let you mess with it and poke it and see what how it reacts to different things. And the more information we have, the more we know, the more we can do, the better we will code when we go back to our code, because we're not going to do this kind of weird shotgun debugging and just like throwing shit at it until it works. We're going to know what we're doing. And though theoretically we're going to have less of that horrible, endless grind. So let's look at the actual console, finally. That's really all you need to add the console to your application. And you're going to want to do this at the root of your application. You can see why. Måste jag lära sig drit. Anyway, so the console sits in the background hidden until you need it. You can bring it up with the Control-Shift-Enter right now, but you can customize that keystroke to whatever you want. You can also lock it so you can only access it after inputting a password or a hidden sequence of numbers or whatever. And it's this kind of window that you can drag around, and you can dock it to the bottom if you want, or just leave it anywhere else and scale it. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing. And immediately, that would be your log output. And I'm going to show you how that ties into Slf IS. So let's simply log a debug message, an info message, a warning, error, and fatal error. Let me run this again. There we go. There are logging, like we get where it came from, we get different coloring for each type. You can obviously recognize the fatal error because it's hideous. And instead of having to do whitelisting and stuff like that, every kind of new tag that comes in gets its own tab. So if you want whatever comes from main, you just click that, or whatever classes. It's just going to be this long scrolling list over here, the more and more classes you have. And everything is concatenated in here. Now I have to remind myself for a moment. Right on. And in general, when you're working with the console directly, you're going to want to use static methods on the console class. You're not going to be creating a new console and instantiating it somewhere and then working with that object. You're going to refer to the console, and that will refer to the created console for you. I mean, there are ways you can create multiple consoles and put them everywhere, but why would you? It's the worst idea ever. So in this case, let's see if we have a good example here. Instead of using logging through SLF, you can just use the print function. And that lets you do all the typical stuff like say hello, define the type for the message, define the tag for it. So if you're not ever going to need that, but it's there if you need it. Another thing you might want to notice is that as soon as I added the view to the stage, these didn't go to trace anymore. Like the console makes itself known to SLF, and then SLF just maps to that instead. And that's great because we can go into release mode and actually work outside of the debug player, which is, especially if you're working with real-time simulation and like heavy particles and stuff like that, it's just a nightmare working in the debug player. It's just painful. That's good stuff. Finally, to integrate the console like more fully with your application, I mean, you can use it as a logging view, and that's going to be fine. But there are different tools that does that actually better. So to get the full kind of value out of the console, you're going to have to do some commands. And commands need functions. So we're just going to create ourselves a simple function that says, say hi. Jesus. We're just going to log hi. We'll call this, we're going to call dconsole create command. And that takes, first of all, a trigger phrase. And we can call this whatever you want. as long as it doesn't have any spaces in it. So just call it say hi. We're going to map it to say hi, the function. And if you want, you can categorize commands, because once you have a really complicated application up, you might have dozens. And once you're running a bunch of plugins on top of this, you're going to have dozens more. It's nice to be able to just do a search of all the commands within a category and stuff like that. So the default is application, which is good enough for us. And finally, you can define a bit of helpful text in case someone other than you is going to use this command. So for us, let's just say it's application. And it says hi. Rebuild this thing. And notice that it autocompletes to anything known. So if we call this, it's going to log hi for us. And you don't have to specify anything else if you want to throw in arguments for this. So if we say, add a name to this. And that call, say hi, Andreas. It's going to say hi, Andreas. And it's going to do some kind of smart guesswork behind the scenes here and try to figure out what kind of type you are passing in. So if I try to pass in, let's say the string 2, I mean, in some cases it's going to know that's a number. It's going, oh, it's a number because this function expects a number, and it's going to throw it a number. In this case, it expects a string, so it's going to throw it a string. So it does that kind of stuff for you behind the scenes. And you can append as many arguments as you want, obviously. So, oh yeah, these debug functions and everything, they work pretty much exactly the same way as trace, so you can do comma delimiting or whatever formatting you want. Let's say hi, Andreas. Whoa, that's interesting. Alltid morsomme bugs. That should have worked. Anyway, so that is the gist of create command. Hmm? What? It's not that, I know what it is. I did a bunch of stuff last night on this thing. It's busted up. Anyway. On top of this, I mean, the console, what is it? You know, you call commands and you get log output. That's the bare bones of what you can expect from it. By adding plugins on top of this, you can start defining things that go outside of the scope of the console. Because everything defined as a plugin is just something that implements an interface, and by that interface gets access to the console internals. And that includes stuff like what scope is the console looking at, and we're going to look into introspection in a bit. And the plugins may also depend on others. So if you created a plugin that grabs a screenshot, you can create a plugin that requires that plugin because it needs to work on a screenshot, that kind of stuff. And you can go from just having a plugin that prints your name when you boot up the console to this crazy 3D manipulator for display objects or molehill or whatever you want to do. It's going to give an example of the impact of plugins on this thing. Let's clear house a little bit. And plugins are registered always through register plugins on the console, and that takes either a comma-separated list of plugin class types, because it treats all plugins like singletons, so it only creates one instance per plugin, or you can pass in what I've called a bundle. So, which is basically just a class that specifies a vector of class instances. So you don't have to write 2,000 long strings of plugins if you have that many. So in this case, a simpler plugin like stats output util. That's the correct name, I think it is. Yeah. Run with that thing. And immediately at the bottom, you're going to get the FPS output, the milliseconds per update, and memory usage. Very simple little plugin. Then you have something crazier on top of that, like this is a classic. I think it was measurement util, or measure util, or measurement bracket. It's under for the systems, Console 2, plugins, measurement brackets, util, there we go. That defines a measure command, which, if I scale the console back a little bit, gives us this little bracket we can drag around to measure coordinates, if that's of any interest. You can also hold the control key and it will just snap to whatever display object you're pointing over, which can be useful sometimes. You just toggle it on and off with the measure command. That's an example of a plugin that uses like when you create a plugin, you get access to 3 layers of the console. You get the background, the foreground, and like the actual background of the console if you need that. So in this case, I'm using the background of the console to access the stage. And then we can just turn on absolutely everything through a bundle, all plugins. And that's, of course, all the plugins that I've created. And that adds a bunch of crap. In this case, you'll immediately notice on the left side, you suddenly have this whole new area for, like we talked about earlier, like custom UI stuff you want done. Right now it's showing the display list as a tree view, which is, I don't know, you can do, like, you can walk the display list just through console commands, but some people wanted this and it's kind of useful. Being able to just see immediately like what objects are where. Notice also you can't select the console, because if you mess with the console through the console, you get these weird infinite loops, and it's just the worst thing you've ever seen. You can turn that off if you really want to. So in this case, I just click on that to select the bitmap on the background. So it should save you some time. On top of that, you have an input monitor. Oh, that's interesting. Which should just give you a list of, I don't understand why that is down. Messed up. It just gives you a list of active keys in your key codes, the local mouse and the stage mouse. The local mouse is local to whatever scope the console is currently looking at. And since we're looking at the bitmap in the background, you're going to get coordinates relative to that one. You can also click to do a hit test versus the currently active scope. You can't even see the background, can you? That's relatively recent. I just wanted to have that in there. And finally, you have a property list. I'm just going to save you a lot of time. Right now we're looking again at the bitmap in the background. Let's get this back. We can do things like look at the transform of that one. Scroll down to like the rotation Y, and there's a mouse wheel on this thing, but I can just tell it to me, oh, you should be rotated slightly, or scale that a bit. You can also get lists of all the methods this object implements. Of course, you can call any of these. And also I've separated getters and setters from variables, because they act somewhat differently. Like you notice mouse X and mouse Y is constantly updated on this one. Like it basically does, it looks up every property on Enterframe as long as the console is visible. So, I mean, it shouldn't be like a performance issue at all. So you can see, just by adding a few plugins, like suddenly we've made things a little easier for us. Like that one. And at any time, you can just list any command that's been enabled by anything. And it's going to give you a shit ton of crap. For instance, the bug report plugin, which is kind of interesting. If I do a bug report, it actually generates an XML file formatted to be compatible with log4j and a screenshot of the screen, bundles it all into a zip file and lets you save that. So if you have a client and something really broke, you can just ask them to call that command. They're going to get a zip file that they can mail you, or you can even write a book that just mails this to you, like automatically if you want. Or list fonts. If that works today. Like any fonts that are currently available in the system. Like tiny plugins, huge plugins, like kind of the list goes on here. Just going to go through some of the highlights of the plugins. Like obviously, like I just said, save zip files of XML logs and screenshots. You can do piping of the console I/O through a JavaScript console. So in case you want to use Firebug instead of the actual console, you can still communicate to the console and get the same kind of input and output through Firebug. You can do remote logging, which is super useful if you're doing, like, I'm doing a lot of Expo installations and stuff like that. If you have 24 machines that are all doing logging, and you want to read all those logs in one place, you can just tell each of them to pipe their logging over a socket to a utility called Apache Chainsaw, which is just this massive log reader software. It's so nice. You can do nerdier stuff like do byte arrays or load and run batch files, which is super useful sometimes if you have like tiny, minute typos and stuff that you're on locations, you have to just fix it right now, and you don't have access to your programming IDE. So you just write a bunch of commands that changes that text to whatever you want, save it as a batch file, and you just have the console execute that every time it starts. It's got the worst kind of patching, but it actually can save your ass on occasion. I just quit my slides. How do you like that? That's my favorite thing. How'd you like this show? It's pretty good.
You should make a command for that.
Hmm?
You should make a command for that. Go to slide.
It's called jump. But I don't know exactly what slide it was. Jump 12. Jump 30 or whatever.
Random slide.
Yeah. Wow, see, that's way too far. So I can do the back or previous commands. Anyway, yeah, there we go. Next. Anywho, so to sum things up so far, add the view to display root, and you want it on the root because once you start adding a ton of other display objects on top of that, you want it to be able to just jump to the top of everything. You enable any plugins that you need. You do your logging through SLF. And if you need to, which you will, you'll integrate the command line interface through create command. And that's the basic use of the console. Just going to talk for a moment about how the console actually kind of looks at your application. Kind of starts by sneaking its way in a little bit. Typically, when you create an application, your main class is going to be a display object. And anything on the display list is you can get there. The display list is completely public. Like the more you decouple your views from your model, like doing proper MVC stuff, then that's going to be less of an issue. But typically, if you just code directly in the display object, that's just like a huge security problem right there. But in any case, so when you add your console to the display list, it immediately knows where your main is. It knows where the root. The root is probably your root application node, and that's where it starts. The console kind of treats you can think of your application like it's a tree, like not just the display list, but think of the entire application as a tree. So once an object contains two other objects, that's like one node with two leaves. And in this way, the console can navigate from one node to the next, to the next, to the next. Kind of like it's like a file system almost, like a folders and subfolders kind of metaphor. And to change the scope, I mean, changing the object the console is currently looking at, you use the select command. And you can also do selection directly from ActionScript. So in case you want your application to start looking with a console looking at an object that isn't public, that's internal or some other such thing, you can still do that. And it kind of gets all this information through a function called describe type, which is in Flash utils, which is kind of awesome. Basically, you call it on any object, and it gives you this huge XML document that just describes everything about it. Like, oh, it has all these functions, and they expect these parameters, and they return these values, and these are not public, but you can still look at them. It gives you everything it inherits from, and by that way, you can call describe type on that again, and you can get everything about anything. It's pretty crazy. And with this information, when it looks into a scope, calls describe type on it, gets a tree of stuff it can do, and you can just call select on anything that it can see there. Or on the display list, obviously. Just going to give you a quick demo of that. In this case, it's not a really complicated application, but already we can see from the initial scope, which is the main, we have two children, the console and this bitmap. If we want to select that bitmap, start with the select command, and we're going to select main, and it all knows what you're trying to do. Like, it just creates a list of anything selectable for you, and it auto-converts to that. Now that's selected, you can notice this one updated accordingly. And then we can start doing things like getting the width of it. I'm just going to spit that out for you. We can set the width of it to something else. And so on and so forth. And you can always go back to the previous step you're on, so you're going to go back to the main. And of course, you don't only have to work with display objects in the sense. We can, for instance, select, this is like the classic Debug Console demo, select the graphics object. You can also call methods. Any public method you can still call. So we're going to call begin fill, the red color. I'm going to draw us a rectangle at 2020, 50, 50. And there it is. So at this point, I guess you start to see how open it is once you start looking at it this way. Of course not. like my dad asked me the same question. Like, why you can break everything? Can you fix things? No. Of course not. This is, I don't know. I thought about it because I don't want to store the state of every object that I look at. It would just be silly. In general, I'm trying to store as little as possible at any given moment, so it doesn't interfere with the garbage collection in any sense. So I mean, even when it's getting its initial like assessment of the scope, like okay, this is what's in there, it forgets about the object, and it forgets about it until you try calling a command on it, and then it will kind of reiterate. But in general, like this thing, once it's in there, it shouldn't mess with anything. It should be as, shall we say, light, like it's touched with a very light on your application. So you can select anything public or visible. You can call any public function. You can set or get anything. And in the end, this stuff is there. Like you're not going to be regularly using this, but it lets you like improvise in a broader sense. So you don't have to go in there and know exactly what you're doing. It's like, oh shit, man, I forgot about that. Like, what was that thing? And you can sort of improvise your way to get the result that you want. Next, just going to talk a little more about the internals of a command. Commands are analogous to functions in general. The only difference is that arguments are separated by spaces and not commas, really, and you don't have those ridiculous parentheses. One thing that's important to know when you're calling a command is that as soon as you enter that text and the interpreter looks at it, that command kind of is the function that it calls. I mean, there's literally no difference inside the console from the text that you put in and the actual object of the function. Same thing with arguments. Like if you type in a command that points to a display object, like internally that becomes a pointer to the display object. And in the same way, commands actually return values. And like I just saw when I called get or set, you get like, actually just do that in here, or probably shouldn't. Whenever something returns, a command returns a value and you're not handling it, it will just spit it out to the log. But you can also use the result of a command as an argument for another command, which we're going to get into. And obviously execute, deconsole execute, which is a function just for calling strings of commands directly on the object programmatically if you need that. We'll also return those values. So subcommands, again, like I just said, are commands that use command return values as arguments. And there are parentheses again. Trying to just run with some meta, like, a parallel to how it looks in the ActionScript. In this case, we have a command that expects the result of command 2. And as soon as you put something in parentheses, it's going to execute that separately, and then this stuff is going to become, internally, whatever that resulted in. So, same thing in AS3. You'll call my function, and you'll use the return value from my other function. And of course, subcommands can have arguments of their own. So, and I know there's a typo here. So command, which takes the result of command 2, which again has another argument for itself, which is analogous to this. And I have a really nice demo for this, which I love doing. Let's say we want to select parentheses. We want to call and child. We want that to be a new flash display shape. Bam. At this point, what I basically did here is I created a new shape, I called addChild on it, I took the return value from addChild and selected it. So now I'm already in the context of the shape that I created. Now I can do the same thing again. Select graphics, this stuff. So thing can go back to the shape and start setting properties on it. Of course, I mean, you're not regularly going to create new objects like this, but it's always nice to have the ability to do this. So, I mean, in some cases, I mean, you could do this iteratively, like call something, like store a reference to what you created, and then select that. But through the syntax, I mean, you can get to your results like a lot faster. Summary of commands. Create commands, like really simple to use. Like just put some text in there, point it to a function, and it just goes. But it lets you do a shit ton of stuff that you wouldn't expect. Finally, I'm going to talk some about writing your own plugins for this thing. Plugins are typically something you will create. Well, if you're like me, you will typically do this. You'll create plugins, like a console plugins package in your project, and stick them in there. And hopefully you'll be able to reuse those plugins later for your other projects. It kind of lets you customize the workflow, customize the console to work better with your workflow. In this case, let's just create a plugins package. And create ourselves a new plugin. And I figured this plugin, just as something that's not already in the console, it's going to just give you a way to check if the current scope is of a given type. Like, is the thing I'm looking at right now, is it a shape? Stuff like that. So we're just going to call it type comparison util. And it's going to implement
Ice Cube.
ID console plugin, and there are a bunch of like variations on this interface. Like some are if you want enter frame updates, it gives you a specific method to handle that. There are for those views in the top left, like anything you need a custom UI for, you have another called a ID console inspector plugin. Long ass names for things, which I like. But in this case, we're just going to keep it simple. And when we're implementing these methods, we have this list. First of all, you don't need a constructor. We don't care about construction. Like, this is your constructor, basically. Once your plugin is registered, it's going to call initialize. The console is going to call initialize on it. But to be able to do that, it needs to know some things about your plugin. And first of all, here's just like a helpful piece of text. So, compares the current scope type to a given type. Good enough. And here's where you define your dependencies. We don't depend on anything, so we're just going to return null. Or you can return an empty vector or whatever, but null is fine. And what you'll see is that during initialize and shutdown, you get references to the plugin manager. And the plugin manager, again, gives you references to a bunch of like the internal bits of the console that you don't really have access to otherwise. So in this case, we need a reference to the scope manager. So let's just say PM scope manager. Just going to store that. And when we shut down, we're going to kill it. So roll that out. And we need a command specific to our plugin. And, in that case, get a reference to the console, create a command, is typed commit. We will call the function is type. Overwrite the previous plugin, the previous command. So I guess I should probably add a numeric plugin increment or something if it finds a command by the same name. Anyway, so we need to register our plugin. So something doesn't work first. And in this case, we are in main, so I could call this type flash display sprite. Sure, sprite. Is it a shape? No. There we go. So if I change my context to this, I call this type. Oh yeah, if you're mid-sentence and you hit the tab key and it does kind of like a search of everything that could match whatever you just typed. So.
Unique style.
Hmm?
Unique style.
I didn't know that. That's cool. So is this thing a flash display bitmap? Absolutely. So that's a very simple little plugin. And ideally, like if you're working with let's say you're working with a game and you want a bunch of plugins for your game, instead of creating a shit ton of commands like in your actual game code, you instead like put them in a plugin and expect that plugin by the current scope, the context the console is looking at, just kind of understand what a command should do. Like it becomes part of your design in a way, and that lets you reuse that plugin for other projects in the future. So my hope for this thing, as it goes, is that people just share their own utilities for it. You can kind of let it grow, and so it becomes kind of like a community developer interface rather than something I use or something you guys use. It's something we can all share it and develop for. Summary for creating plugins: implement ID console plugin or one of the variations thereof. Define your dependencies. Define your description text. Construct and initialize, disrupt and shut down, and use the plugin manager getters because pretty much everything in there, like parsing. You can do plugins that parse custom data and stuff like that. And obviously, we've only scratched the surface of this. Finally, this thing isn't lightweight. It's with everything enabled right now, it's closer to 100K. So if you add this thing to a banner, it's not going to be happy days. But that was never the idea either. It's more like designed to be everything. It's designed to be a power tool that you can really go in and work with, and then just strip it out later. And as you saw earlier, like as soon as the console makes itself known to SLF, then logging goes through the console. Once you ditch the console, it's just going to go back to trace. And SLF is super lightweight. It's like a couple of kilobytes at most. And that makes it pretty easy to implement and remove later. And I was going to have use cases, but this isn't my laptop. So everything's broken. I can talk for a moment about the benefits of actually having logging on, like live in the application as it is published, versus logging in the development environment. Because you're going to have bug reports. You're going to have people that break your application. And what you get, like typically, like this thing is on Google Code, and what I get when people break things is that they give me a reproduction report. It's like, I hit this button and then this happened. And in some cases that's good. I mean, you're lucky if you even get a reproduction report, but if you're working with games, when there's like 5,000 variables, like, oh, I was mid-air firing my gun down while this guy said hello and there were 50 parts. Like, people can't give you that kind of reproduction information, and it's not even going to be useful. So having users be able to give you the log, be able to actually give you detailed information about what happened, it's going to be a godsend. You're just going to make your life so much happier. And sometimes also, I mean, especially if you're working in Expo or even on mobile, you're working with hardware that you can't necessarily develop directly with. Like, you can't just hook your debug bridge directly to the device in some cases. And then being able to go in on each individual device and check the log and poke around in it also save you so much time. Who's going to have a use case? That's kind of it. I'm just going to point to some other libraries you might want to check out if this was of any interest. First of all, the S3 Commons logging, which is much better than SLF4AS. It's 10 times better. Like, those guys worked hard, and I just took like the API, and they took the whole enchilada. Bunch of interesting tools there. They already mapped to Arthropod, Monster Debugger, My Console, like pretty much everything under the sun there are mappings for. So I would really recommend people use that, or at least take a look at it. Second is my prime competitor, Flash Console, which is does a lot of the same stuff that My Console does, but it's incredibly nerdy. Like, it's, I know for me saying that, I guess that's really weird, but it's just like the first time I booted that thing up, I felt like I was Bowman at the end of 2001, like staring into the monolith, you know? I was like, horrible thing. Anyway, it does everything. It is everything as good as what I do, but it's much, much more granular in a sense. You should check it out. It's a different approach to the same problem. And finally, if you don't need all that introspection and all that hacking business, I can't recommend Olog enough. Olog by that dude, which does all the logging front end and gives you this live logging mechanism that's really quite complete. Special thanks and all that crap.
Yes, sir.
Anyway, leaving the session is not allowed.